Hey, Carrie Lynn, how are you?
I am fantastic. And yourself?
I am doing well too. I have to say, yet again, I am super excited about our guest this month.
I want to hear more. Why the excitement?
Well, let's be transparent. This is another guest that we have connected with at the World Federation Right for Dying conference that we went to a couple of years ago. I remember sitting in the room and listening to Dr. Trouton talk about someone that she had been a MAiD provider for who died out in the forest. And I remember thinking at the time, I want to have a chance to talk to this woman about how she sees dying and death and where MAiD fits into that. And so it's taken us a while, but we've got her as our guest today. Dr. Trouton is a clinical professor in the Department of Family Practice at the University of BC. But I'm pretty sure she's going to be Zooming with us today from Southern Ontario, where she did her medical training at Queen's. Shout out. I have some friends who also went to med school at Queen's. She's been to a lot of provinces. She's also hung out and spent time in my home province of Alberta and holds a Master's of Public Health from Harvard, which I think is interesting because when we think about a public health approach to palliative care, about normalizing and socializing our discussions around end of life, I think that also connects really well with medical assistance in dying. And really, part of the reason we are speaking with her today is that she is a co-founder and the present president of the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, which the acronym for that is CAMAP, and has been involved in developing regional and national initiatives, including the Canadian MAiD Curriculum.
I feel this is going to be an incredible learning curve for all of us.
So let's get the conversation going. Thank you so much for joining us, Konia. We really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation. We have a list of things that we want to chat about with you today, but can we first talk a little bit about the Canadian Association for MAiD Assessors and Providers, CAMAP? And can you tell our listeners a bit about the organization and how it works and how it really serves Canadians?
Yeah, for sure. It's very dear to my heart. So CAMAP, we got together shortly after the legislation was changed in 2016 and recognized that a few of us in BC, I was living in BC at the time, wondered how we were going to communicate with each other and share our experiences and how we interpreted the law and how we figured this out in a way that was not compromising our ability to assess the same patient, because there were so few of us initially that we had to figure out how do we combine experiences. So we recognized that not only the six of us who had arrived in Amsterdam together for the International Conference on the Right to Die Society, but additional members right across the country, people who we knew from other experiences and whatnot, realized that this was actually a national need. So within 6 months, we recognized probably 20 people who at least wanted to get the ball rolling and recognized we'd need to do education, we'd need to figure out how to support each other. We'd need to figure out what were common themes of disagreement or confusion and how we could work together. So very quickly, within a year, we established a charitable organization. We started applying for charitable status right away, but we were initially a nonprofit society. And then we got a secure and confidential email listserv for those people who wanted to join. So we actually had a confidential way to say, hey, I'm stuck about what does reasonably foreseeable mean? What does intolerable suffering mean? What do you do when a patient can't speak clearly? What do you do if a different language? What do you do in different cultures? Where do you get medications for oral MAiD? Things that would come up clinically amongst ourselves. And then rather rapidly, our organization grew to the point where we need some administrative support, because initially it was a group of clinicians really doing all the legwork and organization, but realized we needed to have a national conference. We needed to have monthly webinars to educate the clinicians that were growing in this field. We needed to have some guidance documents. And it needed to be an organization that included nurse practitioners and physicians. So it did not have a natural home anywhere else. So people thought, was the Canadian Medical Association? Not really. It's not super welcoming to nurses, nurse practitioners. Is it the Canadian Nurses Association? Similarly, right? So there was not a lot of parallel organizations that we could find a home within it. And the other possible potential area would be the palliative care clinicians with palliative care society. But of course, initially there was some confusion about where was MAiD and where was palliative care. Were they complementary? Were they similar? Were they overlapping? Did they need to be overlapping? So we thought we needed to create ourselves separate, including both clinicians that can do MAiD across Canada, making sure it's national because this is federal legislation. We just didn't need to do it in our own community, didn't need to do it provincially, but we really needed to interpret those legislation requirements in a federal way. Multiple reasons why it came about, but very quickly we identified what do you need? How are we going to support this, and how are we going to do it correctly, and how are we doing it well? Today, CAMAP is 8 years old. It looks entirely different, right? So from our fledgling start, we now have a very robust Health Canada grant to do some of our educational materials. And one of those is our curriculum, which is huge. We do have some charitable donations, substantial donations from individual philanthropists who have subsidized ideas like mentoring, database development, webinars. And our conference actually has some donations. So we actually had an annual conference, which has up to about 500 people, clinicians and experts, legislators from across the country coming to that conference every year. We now have hired staff, which is amazing. We have a full-time executive director and actually 3 full-time staff in addition to that, and 2 part-time staff. That allows us to be able to function and for the clinicians to provide clinical advice rather than doing a lot of the background emailing and making sure networking is continuing on and making sure minutes are correctly done and things like that, the things that are required of a charitable organization. We did receive charitable status 3 years ago. That's been excellent and helpful for those people that want to donate or support a charity that supports the clinicians that do this work, but supports the educational needs of our members.
That has been massive growth in a really short period of time of 8 years. And when you said, Konia, there was maybe 20 MAiD assessors and providers at the onset in 2016, trying to connect. And I have to ask, as somebody who's not all that familiar with how healthcare legislation rolls out, I have to say I was a little bit surprised that something as what to me was as massive as medical assistance in dying was legalized in Canada, because it makes me feel like, how does that work? And I think, thank goodness there were who said, let's do this and let's think critically about it. So can you tell me a little bit about what that was like in the early days?
Yeah, it's a little bit different in every province. And I have to say, Alberta is a bit of an exception that I'll speak to in a minute, because I do have a license there and that was rolled out completely differently. So I think what happened was there were 2 parallel worlds happening. One was the clinicians going, who's going to do this work? Or are you going to do this work? Am I going to do this work? We didn't know, because some people expected that anesthetists would do it because they're all anesthetic drugs. Some people thought that palliative care docs would do this. Some people thought it would be all geriatrics folks, but those people didn't necessarily pick it up. So it was really word of mouth, us calling those of us who were interested and who had attended a couple of conferences or perhaps might have been members of Dying with Dignity, who had a personal interest in it, reached out and just emailed colleagues who you thought maybe they're interested in that too. So there was a lot of emailing and phone calls going on, some of which were positive and some of which were like, oh no, I don't think I'm ready for this or whatever. The clinicians worked in that field in Ontario and BC, so I can speak very clearly to those provinces. Parallel to that, the health organization was trying to figure out, how do we educate nurses in the hospital, social workers who might be getting calls for patients? Do we set up an 811 number for patients to call? Who's going to provide the information to the patients? So Dying with Dignity played a leading role in that. The health authority, who has responsibility for those people that are hired in healthcare, took a lead on that. Clinicians are a bit different because we can decide a little bit, what do we want to do? The College of Physicians and Surgeons had a meeting at that. What qualifications do you think someone needs to have to be able to do this assisted dying? And so we had to set up what that looked like. It should require somebody who regularly assesses patients at a minimum. And were there some educational guidelines that we could adhere to or consider? So very quickly, CAMAP developed that. Alberta was quite interesting and distinct because Alberta Health Services very quickly took the leadership on that, and the College of Physicians and Surgeons took that on initially. So when I renewed my license, I was asked as an individual, would you consider doing assisted dying assessment supervision? And so I yes, but I had no idea any other clinician in Alberta who did it. In fact, I didn't know, working there for 7 years, I didn't know any other clinician until a couple joined the board of CAMAP. So it's interesting that they had a list, an internal list, and they created immediately care coordination hubs, which had that list of clinicians who were able and willing to do the assessments. And they worked with developing the skills of those clinicians. First of all, it's physicians, because we didn't know nurse practitioners would be allowed to do it. And then they added nurse practitioners. I'm not aware of any other province that did it that way, in that kind of seamless, coordinated, let's educate that, hire people, but let's also get the clinicians on board. As a physician, I'm not hired by anybody. I'm self-employed. My salary is not covered by anyone else. I optionally have to put my hand up and let as many people know as possible. I had a slightly different journey because I was providing abortion services across Vancouver Island and across BC. So I just sent an email to all the people that referred to me and said, hello, I'm willing if you have a patient that comes your way that needs an assessment. Some people set up a website and said, I'm willing to do this. Some people let the Ministry of Health know on the provincial health services number. As you said, it was a huge change in healthcare. There's another parallel world. The other parallel world was the medical legal world, because the lawyers had to figure out, oh, this is some sort of junction between healthcare and legal care, and there's an exemption to the criminal code. And so lawyers have to make sure that the doctors are doing things right. Most of us in the first couple of years talked to the medical legal lawyers a lot, trying to understand what they interpreted as the legal requirements for eligibility, and we interpreted it clinically. So there's a lot of co-education going on, which I think was really helpful. They tended to be very conservative. We tended to be more compassionate about people suffering, and we tried to marry those two worlds and figure out how to document and interpret things correctly.
When I think back to 2016, there are still some things that I'm surprised about. Surprised that in some ways, the rollout went as smoothly as it has. And 8 years later, while I don't think it's normalized and socialized to the point for everybody by any means, it's becoming a little bit more part of our fabric of Canadian healthcare, in the way that we are seeing it in obituaries, in the way that people are having conversations. I'm aware as a researcher that I'm in a bit of a different position, and probably happens to you, Konia, as well, that sometimes people will just come up to me out in the grocery store. Hey, you're doing stuff about MAiD. Can you tell me how I would access this? I think I want to ask, do you think we've done it well getting going? Are there things that you're proud to say that we have done well? And are there things that you might, thinking about other countries, and you've mentioned, Konia, that you've been to the World Federation of Assisted Dying Conference, and Carrie Lynn and I met you there in Toronto a few years back. Are there things that you would tell another country to learn from us?
I would probably encourage other countries, and I have encouraged other countries to make sure that you've got a clinician network with the clinicians can talk to each other about sharing cases, manage dilemmas, or even if they were in a quandary, what were the issues that they were weighing in their mind as they tried really hard to help the needs of the patient in front of them is so important. Setting up a standardized educational program at the beginning that everyone agreed to and understood would have been really helpful. I think we did a fairly good job. There was initially a CMA course, and some people had some criticism about it, and some people thought it was okay. But I think that it would have benefited from those of us who stepped forward to offer to assess, and making sure that if the country is going to allow nurse practitioners to do it, that you have to engage the nurse practitioners very early. They stepped a little later into the game, and I do feel badly about that. I'm very proud of our CAMAP national curriculum, which is great, but it just started rolling out last year, and it took 2 years to develop this program. In retrospect, would have been nice to have that right at the beginning. Other than that, I think it was actually managed quite well. I think there was a huge appetite from the public Since 1993, Sue Rodriguez, I think a lot of people sympathized with her situation and her plight, and it didn't go through. But then here we are, 30 years later, with the legislation that works and is helpful for many people.
I think that's absolutely the case. I recall Konia, Kathy and I visiting the museum in Winnipeg, the Human Rights Museum, and standing and witnessing that case of 1993 and seeing its place in the Human Rights Museum as a permanent fixture. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive overview of CAMAP. I want to zero in on this national curriculum because Kathy and I were also at a conference where that was getting spoken about quite a bit, and it's exciting. And of course, MAiD is federally legislated. And healthcare is operated on a provincial and territorial basis. We're hearing a lot in the conversations we have with our guests on the podcast, but also the people with whom we do research, that they are concerned about what's going down in the last little while in BC about the issue of forced transfers. Quebec has decided that that is not going to be an issue anymore. There are no forced transfers done. I'm curious about CAMAP's role in these kinds of things that are coming about in the evolving legislation. I know that there is a curriculum. I get it. What happens is curriculums are two-dimensional and squishy humans are the people who have to work with the curriculum. Is CAMAP, I guess my question is, able to help assessors and providers really navigate a lot of this new and sometimes controversial stuff? The curriculum itself, so we've got two-dimensional didactic parts of that where you go online, you self-study, there's some stuff you type in, some answers, replies. So there are about 10, 12 hours of that kind of work. There's 7 curriculum areas, and you spend an hour to 2 hours on each of those curriculum areas. Assessing MAiD and mental health, capacity and vulnerability, navigating complex cases. But we have a complementary, slightly squishier, as you would say it, squishier part to that curriculum, which involves 5 opportunities for interactive workshops. Those interactive workshops are 2 to 3 hours long, where people come as a group. We've had them both online for people that can't travel as easily, but it works really well in person, and we've done them in person because it creates a community geographically as well, because some of these issues like forced transfers might be geographically situated or might not. When we gather 20, 25 to 30 for each those types of case-based workshops, we go through 6 to 7 cases, or we have a bag of 6 to 7 cases. Sometimes you only end up discussing 3 because we go on a bit of a tangent based on the interest or concerns of the group. If it's a group of clinicians who have done one assessment and got stuck on various things, that's helpful, right? And usually we have a mix of experienced clinicians and newer clinicians. So going through cases helps people, once people have finished the curriculum, even though there's a 2-dimensional and a 3-dimensional part of it, there's actually a 4th dimension, which is we offer them to join CAMAP because we now have 3 confidential different series within our membership. So we have one for case coordinators, for care coordinators. Anyone who coordinates MAiD is in a group together, a virtual chat group. Then there's one for assessors, and there's one for providers. Okay. We also have a general one for people who don't assess or provide, but they're highly involved in MAiD. And those confidential forums are where people can type in a question saying, I have an issue. I can't do MAiD in this facility. What do you do? And they can get an answer from somebody else, maybe on the other side of the country. So if someone in BC puts in a question at 7 p.m., they get an answer by the time they wake up because the person in Newfoundland will have addressed that. In addition, our topics are archived. So if they have an issue they're a little shy to ask, they can always search the archive and see if those questions in that thread has been tackled before. So that's really helpful to people. And they can also get educational credits for not only doing the curriculum, but also participating in the forum. So we encourage people to ask lots of questions and clarify what to do in sticky situations. So that's how CAMAP offers an opportunity for peer-to-peer support throughout their journey. Okay, my extremely messy question. You answered so beautifully. So thank you very much. That clarifies things because I think it's essential to be able to have that reach out. I think it also, Konia, really lends itself to the fact that people, assessors, providers, clinicians, everybody involved, they know they're not alone, right? Regardless of where they are, because MAiD isn't just happening in the major urban centers of Canada, of course. It's happening all over. So those people who are the single assessor and provider in a community, they now have this ability to reach out. Yeah. Yeah, because I think it's helpful in any other clinical situation, whether you've been involved in palliative care, or you work in the intensive care unit, or you work in Emerge. A lot of times you check in with your colleague saying, this is a little unusual. What do you think? And you've got someone physically right there, but we have to create that virtually for MAiD because it's slightly different. So how do we create that clinical area? You asked about areas that might come up that are a little complicated that a lot of people bring up. And one of those early on, of course, was how to define reasonably foreseeable. And so CAMAP does create these guidance documents. What we do is we gather groups of clinicians from across the country, 6 or 8 clinicians, to develop the guidance document. And then we send it out to what we call our stakeholders. We have members of the federal, provincial, territorial advisory committee that looks at that. We have the CMPA look at that. We have the College of Family Physicians look at that. The Canadian Nurses Association look at that. The Indigenous Nurses Association, the Indigenous Learning Group, just to look at these documents, say, what do you think? Have we hit the mark on that? And so when all that has happened, then we translate it and put it up on our website. So any of the clinical guidance documents that are up on our website have gone through this iterative process of not only the clinician putting it together, but it's also gone for broad stakeholder review at many different levels. And then it's gone back to the board to ratify, and then it's gone to our website. So we have tackled a few discussion topics that have popped up a lot, MAiD and dementia, for example, complex clinical conditions. We're just in the process of finalizing our waiver of final consent document. So those kinds of topic areas that multiple people seem to have concerns about or need clarification about, we set about that in a very kind of concerted way. Let's help people.
So is the education that CAMAP provides required for MAiD assessors and providers now?
That's a really interesting question. We did tackle that because when we set up the curriculum, we made sure that the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Canadian College of Family Physicians and the Canadian Nurses Association, the Indigenous Healthcare Association were all involved in creating that curriculum. And we said to them, do you put it as compulsory or not? We decided that it couldn't be compulsory because there wasn't necessarily a way of checking it, and there wasn't a way of verifying it. It wasn't usual in other kinds of healthcare settings necessarily to have that. But some institutions have required that people specify what formal training they've had in assisted dying to be able to do it. So if you're a nurse practitioner working in a hospital, you're going to have to document that, same with the physician. Ours is the most direct and robust educational material you can get. So people are using that as their method of showing that they or demonstrating that they have done some robust education. And that's why they're applying to work in that field, in that facility. So it is increasingly being taken up by facilities.
So dare I say it doesn't sound all that dissimilar to what I know of a palliative approach and education, except on steroids. And it moved, unfortunately, from a palliative care perspective, because it's taken us so long to develop those kind of educational opportunities for healthcare providers. I'm excited to hear that MAiD has managed to do that in a quick time in a way that's accessible for providers. What kind of feedback are you hearing from MAiD assessors and providers around the education?
Most people seem to be very excited about it. We've heard pretty positive comments. In fact, it's interesting that we've had a number of people who have been assessing and providing for 4 or 5 or even 8 years take the curriculum because they want to make sure that they're on track, that they're doing what their peers are doing across the country, and they want to make sure and reassure themselves that they're doing it well. And those people are also training new and upcoming nurse practitioners and physicians. So they want to make sure that they're offering and recommending their students and their trainees the same programs. I think we're up at almost 1,700 people enrolled in the curriculum right now. Some have completed it entirely and some are engaged in it. Considering that Health Canada reported that we have just shy of 1,900 MAiD providers listed in the 2022 report, considering that you've got that many almost registered in that curriculum is pretty good. We were anticipating about 1,000 a year. So we're certainly ahead of target there. We're really pleased with how it's rolling out. And we're really pleased with the spin-off to that, as you said, creating communities, the practice, getting people to know each other, figuring out what they're doing, and how to coordinate and help care for people.
Would you say that the numbers of MAiD assessors and providers are increasing as CAMAP, its reach increases as we front load in perhaps medical schools or healthcare institutions in general?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'd be interested, Konya, to hear what surprised you about all this. Thinking about the legislation, what we're seeing, the increase in numbers of assessors, providers, the number of deaths where people have utilized MAiD. I'm thinking a little bit of some of the headlines that have been floating around lately saying that there are so many people accessing MAiD. Is that something that surprised you?
It did surprise me a little bit, partly because I didn't come from a palliative care world at all. And I think that's probably a little bit my own naivety. But considering that the legislation was driven by patients, that it came into being because of patient concerns, and realizing when a patient or their family is willing to pull their case through so many layers of the court to the Supreme Court, that's a tip of an iceberg. And the iceberg is bigger than I thought. There are a lot of people who really want to have that control and that opportunity to connect with loved ones and have the death at a time, place, and way of their choosing. They want to create opportunities for symbolism, for spirituality. They want to be in an environment that they feel is more therapeutic when they transition or die or leave this world or whatever way they express it. The appetite for that opportunity was stronger than I thought. However, having said that, we realized that the baby boomer population and the people that lived through the war where choice was taken away, they're saying, no, I want to take charge. I actually want to have some autonomy in this. I didn't realize how loud that voice was, but it makes sense to me when I reflect back on it.
I'm with you on that. I was a bit surprised at how loud that voice was. And I come from a palliative care background where one of the pieces I was surprised at is I thought people would use MAiD as one of our participants described it as her back pocket option. If dying wasn't working for her or her disease process got harder than she anticipated it might, or she got tired of dying, because we all know that dying is an awful lot of work. But I think we're seeing, and again, I don't think we have great data collection in this, but we're seeing that for the most part, people are applying and being approved to be able to access MAiD and then following through. Is that accurate, do you think?
I think it's fairly accurate. The government statistics are interesting to me. I look at them and it's only 10% of that don't go ahead. In my experience, all the people I've assessed, about 50% don't go through with it. Sometimes just knowing what MAiD is, me sitting down with them for a long conversation, explaining what MAiD is, what is involved. So it's not really an assessment, it's a providing of information, right? So that's right. If that alleviates their anxiety that they can access this later, fine. I do think that a lot of people feel reassured that it's there and that there is that element of the population that wants to know that it works well. Most people have a lengthy conversation and consideration about this option.
Konya, I wanted to take you back to a term you used just now, therapeutic, because I think would really like to hear a little bit about your experience with MAiD in a variety of settings. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which people have incorporated traditions, have decided that there are certain rituals or memories that are important? And I know that you've even used the term nature, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sometimes the discussion of MAiD is not only whether you're assessed and then proved. We used to incorporate a word in the middle of there called choreography. And some clinicians use it and some people don't. You had two assessments. You put in a formal written request. And then when the two assessments considered that you were approved for MAiD, another conversation that occurs is choreography, planning for the MAiD. And then you have this interesting conversation with people about what does that look like for you? And they'll tell you about how their grandmother has died, how their parent has died, the first person they knew that died, and how that went well or how that did not go well. Sometimes people will say, oh, they were in a dark room by themselves, and I don't want that. I really want to be outside. Okay, let's make that happen. Where outside would you like to be? What about my garden? Oh, let's do it in your garden. They go, do I have to be lying down? Everyone I've ever seen that dies lying down. No, if you want to sit in your recliner chair, that's totally fine. It's amazing because you see this light go on. Oh, it doesn't need to be scary. I don't need to be in a dark room, and I don't need to have my arm here with the IV drip beside me. It doesn't need to look like that. And that provides such liberation, and you get this glimmer of hope and opportunity. For some people, it's been really important they have a gathering of friends with them. And that's really key because most of their happiest moments are spent with that group of friends. They've been in an environment where everyone's been together in a circle and somebody just decided to do the oral route of MAiD. Everyone has a toast. One person's toast is lethal. And so that's joyous because the oral process does take a bit longer. So that provides an opportunity for that large group of people to play the guitar, to sing songs, to reflect on memories, to chat around them, and the person gradually drifts off to sleep over a 45-minute period. So that's an image that person really wanted. They loved going to concerts. They loved falling asleep on the grass, listening to really great music. And we made that happen.
And I love the term choreography. Kathy and I have often heard the term orchestrated. A choreographed is beautiful because what that encompasses is all of it, right? How wonderful. That leads me directly into the next thing that I think I would really appreciate hearing about. You gave a speech in BC and you talked about the professional satisfaction of doing the work that you do. And what I was really curious about is what are the joys of being involved in this work for you as a clinician, but also as a squishy human? What are those things that bring you joy?
The things I enjoy about it are sometimes just that relief that I see when I meet a patient and talk to them and explain what the MAiD process is. I'm not there to diagnose anything. I'm not there to provide a treatment or a drug. I'm just there to explain. And that's fantastic because I'm not often in that position. The other thing I think is providing MAiD itself, helping a person figure out what's important to them. Because even though they might have this vision of dying in a national park beside the cottage that they've been to forever, in fact, they're too sick to get there. It's not possible. So figuring out what the elements are of what creates a beautiful death for them and how do you reframe that? I really like this art of the reframe and what the patient wants and what's actually possible, right? So if they want to be outdoors in a park, yet they're too physically unable to get there, can we have them outside on the balcony of their house, in the backyard? Can we have a video of their favorite outdoor places? Can we have the sounds projected? Can we have smudging? Where is it legal to have smudging? Want to have MAiD and want to celebrate a traditional approach? It's been challenging sometimes in an institution to do some of those really important religious celebrations and spiritual celebrations. How do we do them? Interestingly, most hospitals have rooftop spaces.
Yeah.
Outdoor spaces, which I think were originally created for smoking rooms. So these are things that we as clinicians didn't know. I had no idea there was rooftop space in any hospital. But as I ran around a whole bunch of different facilities, I'm like, wait a minute, everybody has these in Canada. Everybody has private rooftop spaces. So this provides an opportunity for that spiritual end of life to occur as they would have wanted for the community to come together. And to bring drums and to bring music and to bring chanting into the healthcare space. It's incredible, right? It's quite transformative to realize I'll have to wear blue and be in a hospital bed, but we can be outside in a hammock. This provides an opportunity for people to be swaying or rocked into the next life. So these are interesting things that as clinicians, this is not taught anywhere, but the only way to do it is by sharing stories. Removing something from being a clinical intervention to being a creative process that's actually a spiritual moment for that person, their family. We often don't touch on those spiritual, creative transition moments and moments for healing between family members that might not have seen each other for a long period of time, or that opportunity for the final goodbyes. To witness that is incredible. It's quite a privilege to witness the depth of the emotion that occurs in those last moments of someone's life. And I know you do as palliative care folks, but I don't often get that. A lot of my early discussions were, how do you be there because you have to supply medications, but not be in the room so that you can let the family and loved ones be together and transition.
An analogy we've used in palliative care is, how do you not cause too many ripples in the room? You are there, you are doing your essential work, but how do you allow things to proceed as they do? I was listening to you talk, and to me, that's the choreographing that I think we need to talk more about when we're thinking about MAiD. This being a procedure, but rather as a form of care. I'm wondering, do you include that piece in the CAMAP curriculum? Is that choreography piece shared so that people know how to ask questions about those opportunities? In the research that we do, we hear varied stories, just as you would expect. But people will say, there was nothing presented as an option to our family. We booked the procedure, and as crass as this is going to sound, I am paraphrasing from what I've heard from other people, it was like booking a colonoscopy. And we showed up and it was done. And when I hear you talk about the choreography and the spirituality and the potential for meaning making or connection, to me, it becomes painful as a missed opportunity. Was that something you're educating about?
It is part of the providing MAiD chapter topic in the CAMAP curriculum. But I think in different settings and in different provinces, you have different opportunities for doing that. I feel really privileged to have worked in BC for so long in some ways because we had a really robust care coordinating team, nurses who are fantastic, social workers who are fantastic, who connected with the family and addressed a lot of questions in between all the MAiD assessments. Working in Ontario is very different because there's very little MAiD coordination, which means that a lot is left to the clinician. The MAiD coordination in some areas of the country is only done in certain settings or at certain times or by a certain team in a certain way. But I think that the opportunity for a patient to ask and say, I really like it done like this. Sometimes the Dying with Dignity support team is really good at helping people ask those questions. But I don't know whether in some cases patients might be still a bit timid. But I really encourage people to come forward and say, can you make it like this? I can, as a clinician, reflect on what they would like to see and do my best to accomplish that. We don't have to be this close to the patient. So I always carry 3 meters of rope behind me because I'm quite happy to be on the other side of the room. I can see what's going on from across the room. I don't need to be right up beside someone and take the number one spot where their loved one should be. So we do talk about things like that. I think us talking together when we do the curriculum and sharing stories of when it's been magical is so helpful to other clinicians who are trying to do this work.
And I think for people to know what they can ask for. I think Canadians have fought hard, as we were saying, for the autonomous decision to be able to access medical assistance in dying. But there are more things than having the right to access it. We've spoken with people who had a really special drink at the end of life, or I'm reminded of some of the work I did in palliative care. And one time when I encouraged someone to get in bed with their person who was dying. When we have those conversations to let people know what could potentially be an option, that can really enhance that experience. I would imagine, as somebody who will never, I don't think, be able to provide MAiD, as I'm not a physician or a nurse practitioner, but can share those stories in the work that we do so that people know what are opportunities.
I appreciate that we spoke about the highlights and the joys and the ability to bring those things together. What have been some of the challenges for you as a clinician? Kathy often refers to this because of her social work background as that magic wand question. If there was something that you could change about the way we do things in 2024 with MAiD that might make that easier for you and your patients and their families, can you think of things that you think we need to be focusing on as we move forward?
Yeah, there's a few things. Some of the challenges have occurred when there is dissent or discord within the family and how to navigate that. The other part is that the way our healthcare is structured is one-on-one. So I am bonded to my patient, my rapport is with that person. I'm actually not the physician for the family member. I'm not the clinician responsible for the team, those that supported that person through their journey toward MAiD and perhaps through MAiD. So how do you move from this individual way that we've structured our healthcare in Canada to a more collective supporting of the community that supports that person? In many cases, when our clarity is a supportive family grouping that may need some bereavement support, may need some education, may benefit from some questions like we discussed about the choreography piece. We're not really funded or paid or whatever to support the family. I'm not sure how we would change that, but perhaps offering a salary to MAiD coordinators who are actually focused on the family support would be really great. As the president of CAMAP, deflecting things, there is a thought that perhaps we are providing MAiD too fast or it's too easy to get MAiD. And I think, when those sentiments come up, I feel terrible because I think, my goodness, the clinicians who have stepped forward to do this, I am inspired by them all the time that they have stepped in addition to the regular practice. They've sought out training. They've been the lone person in their community. This is an amazing thing to do. They've responded to the suffering that they're hearing and then done education and training, and they're redoing their training, making sure they're doing it right, documenting things so carefully. And for someone to think that it's too easy for a clinician to approve somebody, wow, this clinician went through a lot to be able to learn how to do this. And it is very thoughtful and careful. When I see them struggling with really difficult questions and coming to a conclusion, it is not easy for a clinician to do this. It is not easy for a patient to come forward if they're from a certain background or perhaps the family doesn't support it. It's hard for both the clinician and the patient. It's not quick. If things are urgent, like everything in healthcare, we can make things happen quickly, but this is a very considered area. So I just add about that. I would like to see more supported care coordination.
I hear you on that too. And I think that would be beneficial to clinicians. Would also be beneficial, as you've said, to those who accompanied someone who is accessing MAiD. And I think that, again, puts it on more of a continuum of care as opposed to a medical procedure that occurs at the end of life. I noticed, of course, on the CAMAP website, which we will link to for our listeners to check out, that you do have a public forum or a public information tab. Is there something you wish Canadians understood differently about MAiD?
I think, if anything, it would be that MAiD can be accessed when you need it. And if it's urgent, it will be accessed. It will be responded to urgently. I think people might be afraid that they can't get it. And so if they put in their request really early on, that we will be able to attend to that. If you have Canadian health insurance and you're over the age of 18, at that point where you have irremediable, so great, then we can help you. So we don't need to jump that early. We're out there to help you. We're always willing to help you, and we will do that urgently. So that concern, I think, I wish the public understood better, had better faith that we will respond. We will respond. The other question that comes out a lot from the public is about MAiD and dementia. And that is a whole huge different topic area, which I'm sure you will delve into in another session. I think people do want to have MAiD in place for when they get advanced dementia, when they can't recognize their loved ones. And currently that is not legal or possible in Canada. There is limited opportunity for MAiD when someone has dementia. So that's a big topic area.
In August, our podcast hosted some of the digital stories that we've created with people who've accompanied someone who used MAiD. And there's one story in particular that talks about that. And it's very important, that digital story creator, that message gets out correctly. I think that there's growth in Canada around MAiD in terms of how it's delivered as a form of care, how we think about it, and we learn from different provinces in terms of effectiveness of coordination, as you've referenced, and also in terms of the education that we provide. What do you think is going to happen in the next few years in terms of medical assistance in dying, if you were to look in your magic ball, Konia?
I am optimistic about the MAiD coordination. I think it might get a little bit better. CAMAP, we've tried to help facilitate a knowledge exchange workshop. We call it knowledge exchange between different provinces. We've got key players in each province and territory sitting down together and deciding, what does a robust coordination look like? What are the elements of a service? Those players, I think, will learn from each other and might put in place some opportunities for people to improve their care. It's hard to know federally what's going to happen politically and also provincially, whether that will cause some pause in what we do and how we do MAiD. But I think that the voices that we spoke about in the beginning of the conversation, the voices from the public that really want this opportunity, that have seen their neighbor, their sister, their spouse have this opportunity, they don't want to lose it. So I don't have any worry that this legislation will be stopped, halted, or ended, because those voices are much too strong. The voices of the public are much too strong. I am optimistic that things will get better for us as clinicians trying to help people and trying to help them help their families. The voice clamoring for continuing and allowing this legislation to be in place will continue.
I really appreciate how you've highlighted that as Canadians, we've got a role and a responsibility in this, that the clamoring of our voices are heard, and there's a ripple effect in that. And we know Canadians have thoughts, opinions, and want to move things forward for themselves. And they also want, as you've highlighted, well-educated, well-informed, and compassionate and caring clinicians to support them as they move through the ends of their lives. And so I want to say thank you so much for all your work, advocacy, and leadership in this area. Congratulations on the education that CAMAP is leading. And I really appreciate you having taken time to speak with us today.
You're really welcome. It was a pleasure. I've learned so much from my patients and really wanted to be able to share some of those teachings with everyone. And so thank you.
Oh, Cabby, you were so right to be excited. What? It's so incredible. I still have quotes and little phrases running in my head. And you were so right about the opportunity to hear about MAiD in a variety of settings.
And one of the things I really appreciated from this particular conversation is Konia's ability to talk about MAiD from a clinical perspective, about what's required for assessors and providers to be able to navigate from an education perspective, a clinical perspective, understanding the law as it applies, capacity consent, all those pieces of MAiD, but also then taking it to the next step and thinking about the opportunities that can go hand in hand when somebody says, I would like to access MAiD. So thinking about location, thinking about the choreography and the opportunities that presents. And I think for me, this was a bit of a unique interview in somebody who can really kind of balance both of those pieces.
Absolutely. I think that's very true from my understanding of it. That magic wand question, where she was able to say to us that idea that as the clinician, having that one-to-one relationship, how are we taking care of the other people who are involved? The person who has opted for MAiD, not in every case, but in many, many cases, that person comes with family, chosen or otherwise, friends, a support system, people who are integral to that journey. And how wonderful to think that we might be thinking about teams, MAiD care teams, as we've talked about in the past, who can speak to that.
And I think that CAMAP, in terms of the education that they're providing for clinicians, have highlighted, as Konia did as well, that it's the coordination piece that we really need to learn from other provinces who are doing it really well, but also to think about how can we continue to improve this? Because as we recognize in our conversation, the numbers of people who are accessing MAiD, be it for an assessment or assessment and a provision, are larger than we anticipated. And so that's going to require coordination. And I think about the sustainability and the viability for clinicians, regardless of how great their education and support process might be. We need, again, to pay attention to the systems.
Absolutely. Who do we need to talk to next, listeners? Who would you like us to have these conversations with?
And you heard Konia talk about MAiD and dementia. So if someone out there is listening and knows somebody who has some thoughts, some experiences in this area, and think they might be a great guest for us to chat with, please send along the name. Connect with us on all of our socials, including our website, Drop us an email. We would love to hear from you, dear listener, in terms of what stories are we missing? Where should we take our conversation next? So until next time, thank you for listening.